You're tuned in to the Reality Fred podcast. Food and travel, cool stuff, weird stuff, entertainment, and more. You made the choice to be here, and my friend, you've chosen wisely. Now buckle up, because it's time to get started. It's time for the Reality Fred podcast.
All right, everybody, welcome back, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Reality Fred podcast. And today, I'm very excited, a little bit more than usual, because not only do I have a special guest with me today, this is my first live in basement studio guest, number one, but also number two, we're going to be talking about an awesome topic, and that is whiskey. So, I love talking about whiskey and bourbon and all things. I usually understand the main process, what's behind it, the ingredients, the process, and things like that. But in terms of getting down to the nitty-gritty of exactly how it's made, everything that goes into it, and all the variations that you can do with the ingredients and the process to really change the product, that's where, unless you've done it, you really can't appreciate everything that goes into it. So today I'm joined by Chris Batten, a friend of mine who knows the process, who knows the nitty-gritty and the variations and the possibilities, because he was a whiskey distiller. So, Chris, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me over here, Fred. I appreciate it.
Yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun. And so we're going to talk about the whiskey-making process. And, of course, and then Chris brought some samples of whiskeys that he had made in the past. And are these aged whiskeys, or are these kind of like the White Lightning still, like the
some
distilled
of these
product?
Yeah, some of these, most of these actually are unaged spirits, and some start with a whiskey base, and others start with a fruit base, and there is a barrel-aged peated recipe as well.
Okay. And I guess Chris reminded me to be right before we hit record. When the one thing I want to let you know is that the nice thing that's going to be fun about this is absolutely no preparation for tonight's show. We're just jumping right into it.
Off the cuff.
Yeah, off the cuff. So this is just going to be some fun conversation about whiskey making. We didn't want to make it boring with pre-planned questions and things like that. So it's going to be basically, I have questions, of things that I want to learn a little bit more about, and I'm sure as Chris enlightens me, we'll have some follow-ups and things like that. But one thing that Chris reminded me about before we got started is to just remind people out there, and I don't know if it's I think it's a federal thing. It is illegal to make your own whiskey at home, right?
It is illegal to make whiskey at home. You can
to distill, basically.
Right? Basically. Once you cook it, once you make that beer and cook it, it is illegal at that point. But you can apply for an E85 fuel permit.
Okay.
Which allows you to make a simple fuel that you could run a tractor off of, or even your own car, for that matter.
There you go. And if you're filling up and get thirsty, perhaps.
Right.
Well,
you may want to filter that 1,000 times, though.
Okay, so that's how it would work. So today's episode is not about how you should go out and start making whiskey, but for those of us that like to enjoy whiskey and want to learn a little bit even more about the intricacies of the process. And the reason I wanted to do this with Chris is because over the past year of Chris, as we have hung out on different guys' nights and things like that, and enjoyed a few sips of bourbon, I thought I knew quite a lot about bourbon from my time doing the Bourbon Trail and just and researching it myself. I thought I knew a lot, and then every time you begin to talk about the process, I realized how much more there is to know, and that's why this is exciting, because now I finally get to sit you down and pick your brain, basically. Mm-hmm. So let's first start, if you did say that it was okay to mention, and just to give you guys a little bit of background about Chris. So there is a local distiller in Pittsburgh that you are associated with, and that's Wiggle. So do you want to tell us about what your relationship is with Wiggle and what you've done there with them?
Yeah, I did work for Wiggle for a little under a year, so I still maintain a relationship with them, in terms of, friendly relationship, bounce things off them, go to see them every so often. I do not work for them anymore due to my other full-time position in the carbonated beverage industry. But, still maintain a healthy relationship with them, and I was in their sales and marketing department, so I took care of all their PLCB tastings and sales events, which would include also branching out into restaurants and bars as well.
Okay, and then another I don't know really what to call it, but it was once upon a time a local. It's called West Overton Village here in Scottsdale, Pennsylvania. There's a village called West Overton, and at one period it's a historical whiskey distiller, a rye whiskey distillery, I think, right?
Yeah.
And there was recent talks about getting that started back up. It didn't go through, but the discussions were going, the investing was going, and then kind of like the experimentation of discovering the old recipe and style and things of how that rye whiskey distillery did it. So you had some additional distillation going on there.
Yeah, I would consider it research and development. Because the recipe had been brought to life again. They gave us the original recipe. My partner and I, we kind of looked at things and kind of made recommendations based on bringing that recipe more current, because it was called a rye whiskey back then, but by today's distilling standards, you could not call it a rye whiskey because it was more so a corn based
recipe. It
recipe.
wasn't that 51% rye.
Exactly, it was more or less a 70% corn. With rye and malt.
Okay.
So back then you could pretty much call it anything you wanted to.
Ah, wow.
Because it was the 1800s through the early part of the 1900s.
Yeah.
And then they started getting strict on those laws.
Huh. I did not know that. So, because living here in Pennsylvania, we pride ourselves a little bit, especially you go to the stores, you start seeing, I don't want to call it like this uber resurgence, but before Kentucky was the place of bourbon, things like that, the whiskey, basically the United States was out here on the East Coast, rye whiskey being made here in Pennsylvania and stuff like that. But today, with the resurgence of some Pennsylvania-made rye whiskeys back in the store, so what you're saying, while we pride ourselves on our history here in Pennsylvania of rye whiskey, what you're saying is perhaps a lot of the times back then, it wouldn't actually even really be the standards of rye whiskey today, because it wasn't that 51%.
Not
just
by
that it had it at all, I guess.
Not by any means, but they did that just because it had rye in it, and it was more palatable for people to drink that whiskey because of the corn, the sweetness of the corn. So to make a whiskey back then with 100% rye or even half rye, was really not as palatable. So rye whiskey, even though it was made back then as well with using more rye, it was traditionally known as an old man's whiskey.
I gotcha. Okay. So actually, don't want to go off too far, but when we're talking historically then, because this is something I didn't know, so it interests me. So you were saying in these cases still may have only been about 30% rye or so, and we're in those days we're calling it rye whiskey.
Right.
So what was the difference then? So when as Kentucky's growing in bourbon and it's more corn, if that 70-30 corn rye, if it already still 30%, is that really that much different from what was going on in Kentucky? Really?
No, not a whole lot.
Okay.
I mean, based on some of the recipes, again, they were just calling it rye.
I gotcha.
But then there were other distilleries that were making rye in conjunction with their pseudo rye whiskeys.
Okay.
But this area was the hub of rye whiskey manufacturing. They made roughly I think 1.5 barrels of rye whiskey for every man, woman, and child in the United States. That's how much rye whiskey this region turned out.
That's amazing. So we could all have our own warehouse, essentially, and pass it on to the kids, the grandkids, the great-grandkids, and so on. Okay, so moving forward, so what I would actually do, I don't want to make this episode about Scotch, but I kind of want to just start with Scotch briefly. It is a whiskey. I just got back from Scotland in April, and I didn't really know this until I went there and did a distillery tour. And the reason I'm bringing this up, so here in the United States, when we talk about whiskey and bourbon, we're talking about corn and rye. Maybe sometimes the rye is replaced by wheat, but also then the barley. So kind of at least those three grains, right? But when I went to Scotland, there's no corn or rye. It's just the barley.
No, just barley. Right? Like traditional Scotch, is made with just barley, really. Peated. It could be peated and smoked. unpeated, unsmoked, lightly smoked. I mean, there's different variations of barleys, which you can vary the smoking process as well.
That's why I brought up the Scotch as a starting point. So if you can make whiskey from just barley, let's talk about that for a second, and then we'll kind of delve in with the corn and the rye and kind of complicate matters, I suppose. But so if we talk about Scotch just for a moment, so okay, I want to make whiskey. I'm in Scotland. Let's not worry about the peat for the moment, but the basic ingredients, are we just talking water and barley?
Yeah.
And is that it?
Yeah. I mean, basically you're boiling that barley, and you're releasing the enzymes and the sugar.
Okay.
Because every grain has sugars in it. You just have to release them by getting them to a certain boiling point to release the sugars and the enzymes, and the enzymes within that naturally occur within that barley is what helps break down those sugars.
Okay.
Breaks down,
Now, when is yeast come into play at this point? Is yeast something? Because that eventually that's part of the process. Isn't there like a yeast strain that has to be used? I remember being on the Bourbon Trail and different places. I remember Four Roses talking about how they just have this amazing yeast strain and things like that, or to make Scotch. Is that something that's necessary at this point still?
It's not particularly necessary, but in order to consistently maintain a certain flavor profile,
okay,
a lot of distilleries will use their own strain of yeast that they've really created, and they keep harvesting that yeast over and over again.
And is that what's coming after the mash process? Is that where that is created essentially? Then?
Yeah, after you get done boiling your grains,
okay,
and then you transfer that to a fermenter. You cool it down to a certain level.
Yeah,
and then you add your yeast.
Okay, all right. So that's where that comes from. So what I want to do, backing up then, when I was in Scotland and they were talking about the barley, so you're basically saying kind of step one in this, just making a whiskey straight from barley. Of course, you boil the barley essentially to release the enzymes and the sugars and things like that. Now, they were saying how it came to them already already malted. So this is still before that step. So can you tell us what it is to what does that mean first? Let's just start with that. What is malted barley? And that is something that occurs before you do this boiling process,
right? Before the malt even gets to the distillery. When I say malt, malted barley.
Okay.
Before it even gets in their hands, the grower will halt the growing process.
Okay.
So once that happens, it's halted at a certain stage, and that way they're ensured that enzyme is more active. You know what I mean? They get the primary, the optimum amount of enzymes at that point by halting the process.
And is water part of that, or is that a heating thing? Are you putting it in water as part of the malting process?
No, I think they. I'm pretty sure they lay the barley out.
Okay.
Like in I mean, it's a larger scale operation, so they're really laying that barley out and then killing drying the barley and stuff.
So when we see then, like with Scotch, when you see the peat process come in where they're smoking it, is that part of that malting process
after it gets malted, then it goes to the smoking process, I believe. And then they smoke it in certain there's different ways of smoking peating that barley.
Okay.
So.
All right, so hopping back to, we'll kind of come back to the States, basically. So, unlike Scotland, which we just used the barley, so really at this point in the States here, for the main part, we're using malted barley. It's always malted barley, right? It's never unmalted.
You could use unmalted also. I mean, there are various combinations. Based on their recipe, it could be malted. Some unmalted barley, some smoked peated barley, and mostly peated.
Yeah.
It depends on the flavor profile that distillery wants to accomplish.
Okay, and so let's even talk about that. So what is different types of barley going to bring to the final product? So whether it's malted or unmalted, let's say, what is it bringing differently to the final product? Do you know? There's
so many different types of barleys, but I mean, the range of